First question, am I qualified to raise VC? How do I know?
Hey, Ed, let me ask you this. You've been on the VC side. What percentage of people would you have said were qualified to talk to you as a GP at a firm?
If we're talking about the overall population of founders, we're talking every founder,
Yeah.
less than 10% all the time.
In what criteria would you use? Like what filter makes you go, they should not even be asking? What does that look like?
It has to do with the notion of the difference between, this is the first level, difference between a startup and a small business. And quite often, a lot of founders think they need to be raising money, and sure, they might need capital, and that makes
Everyone
a lot of
needs
sense,
money, yeah.
right? But to go to a startup investor, if you came to me and I've got a startup fund and our investment thesis is startups, you're just not doing anything innovative, game-changing, hyper-growth, technology-driven, and that's usually right away where the sorting starts, is that you need to go to a bank or you need to go get other sort of mainstream investors. Startup, venture capital, we are a subset of an alternative asset class, right? That comes from like sort of the private equity tree, but we are bonkers in the VC world. So immediately that's the conversation that starts.
I remember distinctly how unqualified I was to raise capital with here's the best part, with what might have been the best business I have ever started. Okay, so just I'll take you to a little time machine.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to the early 90s, mid 90s, right? And I had started one of the first web design companies. It's hard to even think that now, one of the first web design companies. And I got an introduction to a venture capital firm, right? When I didn't even know what venture capital was. I'd never heard the term before in my life. It was kind of all in the media at the time, Ed, like in the 90s, because Netscape was a thing and whatever. So I take the meeting and I'm sitting in the meeting. I don't even know what to present, right? So when you're talking about, am I qualified? Number one, I'm like 19 years old. Right. Number two, the internet kind of didn't exist yet, not in the way we know it. So you couldn't find out information about like, what is a VC? Like Wikipedia hadn't been invented yet. Google hadn't been invented yet. Right. I'm 19 years old and I go into this meeting and I'll never forget the managing partner of the firm. He asks me, he's like, do you have projections? Do you have pro forma financials? And I'd never heard that word before in my life. And he could tell I had never heard it before in my life. Get back to being qualified. And he goes to me and he's like, it means like how much money you think your company will generate in your expenses. Like, oh, absolutely. And get this. I reach into my pocket because that's where you're expected to keep your company financials, right? I reach into my pocket, I pull out a slip of paper and I unfold it, right? Because this is how pro I am. And I hand it over to him like, boom, there it is. And he looks at it and I'll never forget the look on his face. He's like, this is how much you owe your roommate. And like the fact that you have $400 in your bank account. I'm like, wasn't that the question you asked? He's like, no, okay, that's not the best part of the story. So needless to say, they pass. I mean, it's a hard pass, right? Now, here's the funny how life works. Their offices just happen to be what would wind up being across the street from our future offices at same company. Company goes on to grow to a $700 million company in 4 years, right? We win a $250 million contract like a year later, and we end up staffing to like 1,000 people right across the street from them. Okay, like in the same parking lot. We shared a parking lot. And so they would see this idiot pulling up in a brand new Lamborghini, right? The same idiot who was like, I don't understand what a pro forma is or, whatever. And I ended up in the strangest like twist of fate. I ended up meeting the son of the owner of that firm in Santa Monica of all places, right? Great guy. And he started his own firm and he would tell that story. He's like, you're like a legend at that firm, right? Of being the most unqualified investment that we ever miss. And he was like, nothing about that was investable.
Those stories are amazing. I'm curious, well, did you end up raising money for that venture? What happened?
We didn't. We bootstrapped the whole thing. We grew it to about 700 million in billings, which isn't all revenue. And we sold it to Dan Snyder, the owner of what was the owner of the Washington Commanders, who had an incredible career, obviously, outside of that.
I had no idea that was a story. Now you're even more legendary in my mind. But let's talk about this for a moment, because I think a lot of founders, like you and I, we've been through so many different cycles of this, like so many bubbles right from the get-go. Like when the internet just became a thing, things have changed. So back then, investors were looking for different qualifications. I would say it was more like bankers, and they needed all that due diligence, and they wanted things like business plans and pro formas. Today, VCs, like I actually sat on a due diligence meeting today, investors trying to raise capital. We didn't ask any of that stuff, right? We were asking a whole bunch of different things. How has it changed in terms of the qualifications or the way VC's done today?
I think what's changed so dramatically is that so many companies have come from just idea or just MVP or just this formative Facebook early kind of stage to go on and become billion-dollar companies, that investors have no longer believed that they can diligence their way into good deals, right?
Yes.
In other words, there's so little trending data to go on, and you're playing with a founder, with your money, who's probably never started a business before. This isn't like the old school silver haired fox that people were invested in, right? This is a 24-year-old in a hoodie,
Yeah.
and you have no idea. Like, this person has no, resume or past experience. And so that story has played out so terrifically so many times that at some point investors look at the trend line and they're like, honestly, other than the idea's got a big market, I'm not going to be able to diligence my way into knowing this is a good investment or not. What do you think?
Exactly. We have gotten good as an industry, and I'm not even really in that industry anymore, but I know how it works. We've gotten good at pattern recognition. It's like,
Yeah.
do they look like a tech bro wearing a hoodie and they haven't gotten a lot of sun and they live off ramen noodles? All right, maybe it's going to be good type thing. So the question then, Will, for the audience, so how do you know if you're qualified for VC? And maybe you can expand it to other types of investors as well. Break it down.
Sure. First thing I would say is you probably are not qualified. By definition, most founders are not qualified in the way they think. Like, it used to be like, well, I guess I got my MBA and I guess I've got like this. Most founders that wind up doing the best have the worst qualifications of all time, right? Like, if you look at, famous founders like Brian Chesky from Airbnb has been all over the news lately, with his founder-led companies. But we did an interview with Brian when he was first starting, and in his story, it's hilarious, right? Like how unqualified he was. Coming out of Rhode Island School of Design, RISD. And he said, for a long time, I lived in my parents' basement, right? This is the CEO of one of the most like promising, biggest outcome companies there is. And he's one of a gazillion. Here's what I'm going to say. There isn't some certification you get that makes you qualified. What makes you qualified is the deal that you're doing, is the market size you're going after. He was trying to upend the hotel industry.
Yeah.
That's what made him qualified, not who he was.
And they had made significant progress, not necessarily Airbnb the way that it was when they got their initial checks, but they showed enough of those qualities that I remember listening to their initial investors. It was Jessica Livingston and Paul Graham, Y Combinator. And Jessica Livingston was like, I didn't get it. I had no idea what they were doing, but we really like them, right? And so that goes back to what you're talking about. It's like, no, it doesn't tick the boxes MBA. And that's what happened. Let me share my story. This is a good one, right? So I'm in China and we got seed investment. They had to move us over there and I had to go be the CEO. So that was part of the package. So I'm in China. They would not present me anywhere publicly because I didn't have a PhD. There were a lot of PhDs, doing the speaking circuit or whatever.
Sure.
But then these other PhDs that took me on, there were 3 doctors, and they took me on. These are like cognitive scientists and, people like really, really smart people, right? Teaching at the top universities. They took me out. I remember this to this day. They took me out for hot pot and they said, we have a question for you. We are smarter than you. And I was like, that's a statement, not a question. Right? Okay. And
great opener.
They said, but we want to know, why is it that you're making more money than all of us? And I told them straight out, I said, I am a business person. I am first and foremost a founder, and I am not strapped down by all the academia and all the, credentials and stuff that you think you need to go out and make money. I'm just going to sell a solution. And by then, I was in the boardrooms of Alibaba and, like Tencent and all these places, and they were just watching this happen. And I was obnoxious enough, but I didn't need those qualifications the way, to your point, that everybody else thought that they need.
Right, exactly. And I think founders get hung up because they believe there's some other echelon of qualifications that they don't have. And if they had those, again, the MBA or whatever, they could get that. But this isn't like a big corporation trying to hire you by your resume. This is someone, a cowboy, right, being the investor, saying, I'm going to make weird ass bets on companies that have the longest shots possible.
Yes.
And the weird people behind them. I technically don't think that any founder is qualified. I think your business idea is either qualified, and that has a whole other set of credentials. And the good thing is you don't have to worry about it.
And here's some advice for everyone. If you're wondering if you're qualified for a certain type of investor, they are usually upfront about it. Like, they will tell you, we need to see this amount of revenue.
Whether you like it or not.
Exactly. Like, just go do the research, and then you will know if you're qualified or not. But I like, Will, where this conversation went. We're encouraging founders, don't worry about your personal qualifications. Hey, roll with it. Do the deal. Build a great startup, and you will see your qualifications go before you.